For thousands of years, skeptics have constructed arguments against God's existence. Each generation produces new objections, more sophisticated challenges, sharper logical problems. Yet through every era, defenders of faith have responded with equal sophistication, developing answers that millions find compelling. What's remarkable isn't that one side wins decisively, but that this intellectual exchange reveals something profound about reason, evidence, and what it means to believe. This isn't about dismissing honest doubt or pretending every objection has an easy answer. It's about examining how thoughtful theists engage the hardest challenges to their faith. We'll explore classical responses that have stood for centuries, modern reformulations using cutting-edge philosophy, and surprising insights that transform objections into opportunities. We'll see why brilliant minds find these answers satisfying, even when critics remain unconvinced. If you're finding value in this exploration, I'd genuinely appreciate a like or subscribe. It makes a real difference in helping these ideas reach more people. And I'm always curious, where are you watching from? Drop a comment with your city and the time there. There's something special about knowing we're all thinking through these big questions together, scattered across the globe. Now, settle in somewhere comfortable. Maybe dim the lights or put on some background sound, and let's begin this journey together. We're diving into how defenders of faith answer humanity's toughest questions about God. Part 1. Answering the problem of evil, the soul-making defense. A child suffers from cancer. An earthquake kills thousands. Parasites inflict agonizing pain. The problem of evil seems devastating. If God is all-powerful, all-knowing, and perfectly good, why does suffering exist? This objection has shaken more faith than perhaps any other. Yet defenders offer responses that millions find compelling, not by minimizing suffering's horror, but by reframing its role in a larger story. The logical problem claims God and evil can't both exist. They're logically contradictory. Alvin Plantinga's free will defense solved this so effectively that even atheist philosophers now concede the logical problem fails. Here's the key insight. God could create free creatures who always choose good, but they wouldn't be genuinely free. Real freedom requires the possibility of choosing evil. Now, you might object, why not create people who freely choose good? Plantinga shows this may be impossible. Perhaps in every possible world with free creatures, some would choose evil. If creating free beings who can love, grow, and make meaningful choices is valuable enough, then God is justified in accepting the risk that some will misuse their freedom. Critics say this solves moral evil, but leaves natural evil. Earthquakes, diseases, animal suffering, unexplained. Enter John Hick's soul-making theodicy. This world isn't meant to be paradise, but a classroom for spiritual development. You can't develop courage without danger, compassion without suffering to relieve, patience without trials, or faith without uncertainty. Think about virtues you most admire. They're forged through challenge, not comfort. The person who faces cancer with grace, who helps others despite their own pain, who maintains hope through devastating loss. These responses to suffering reveal depths of human nobility that couldn't exist in a world without real hardship. But surely God could have created mature souls without the process? Perhaps not. Essential human goods, growth, achievement, earned character, require journeys, not instant creation. A programmed saint who never chose goodness, never struggled, never overcame, isn't truly virtuous. They're an automaton with virtue's appearance, but none of its substance. The severity objection presses. Why this much suffering? Couldn't less achieve the same soul-making? Here defenders make several moves. First, we lack God's comprehensive perspective. We see individual tragedies, but not how they ripple through generations, how they shape characters we'll never meet, how they enable goods we can't imagine. Second, the gradual escalation of challenges makes sense. Life starts with smaller trials, playground conflicts, minor disappointments, building capacity for greater challenges. Without this progression, we'd be overwhelmed. The intensity of suffering we can face grows with our developed strength. Third, meaningful soul-making requires real stakes. If God intervened to prevent every tragedy, we'd know suffering was limited, safety guaranteed. This knowledge would transform the environment fundamentally. Fear wouldn't be real fear. Sacrifice wouldn't be genuine sacrifice. Courage wouldn't be authentic courage. The soul-making environment requires genuine danger. Animal suffering presents special difficulty. Animals don't develop morally, so why do they suffer? Some defenders argue animals lack self-awareness, making their suffering less intense than it appears. Others suggest animal suffering enables human responses: veterinary care, conservation, compassion toward creatures that develop our own character. Richard Swinburne adds another dimension. God has reasons to create a predictable natural order with consistent laws. Tectonic processes that cause earthquakes also create fertile soil and mountain ecosystems. The same physics that allows helpful action allows harmful action. Constantly intervening to prevent natural evil would make science impossible, rational action impossible, learning from experience impossible. Critics respond that an omnipotent God could surely create better laws, less cruel mechanisms, nature that sustains life without parasites that blind children. Defenders reply that we're evaluating isolated mechanisms without seeing the whole system. Perhaps these apparently cruel processes serve essential ecological functions we don't fully understand. The distribution objection remains powerful. Why do innocent children suffer while wicked people prosper? Here, defenders appeal to eschatology. The afterlife transforms the equation. Unjust temporary suffering can be compensated eternally. The child who suffers needlessly will receive eternal joy that makes their suffering a minor episode in an infinitely good existence. This doesn't justify causing suffering or ignoring it. Evil remains evil. But it means God can permit temporary injustice knowing ultimate justice will prevail. The wicked who prosper temporarily will face ultimate accountability. The innocent who suffer temporarily will receive ultimate vindication and compensation. Marilyn Adams argues, God must not just compensate, but defeat horrendous evil, integrating even the worst suffering into lives that are, taken as a whole, worth living and even wonderful. Union with God in eternity provides good so profound that victims will be grateful they existed despite their suffering. The evidential problem admits God and evil are logically compatible, but argues the amount and type of evil makes God improbable. William Rowe's example: a fawn trapped in a forest fire, suffering for days with no one to witness or learn from its agony. This seems like gratuitous evil, suffering that serves no purpose. Skeptical theism responds, we shouldn't expect to understand God's purposes. The gap between divine wisdom and human understanding is too vast. What seems pointless to us might serve purposes we can't fathom. preventing greater evils, enabling distant goods, fulfilling roles in God's comprehensive plan that exceed our comprehension. Critics object, this makes God's goodness meaningless. If any amount of evil is compatible with God's goodness because we can't understand divine reasons, then calling God good becomes empty. Defenders reply that we have independent reasons to believe God is good. Cosmological arguments, moral arguments, religious experience. So when we encounter apparently gratuitous evil, trust in God's goodness gives us reason to believe it serves purposes we don't see. The soul-making theodicy doesn't eliminate mystery or pain. It doesn't make suffering easy or doubt disappear. But it provides a framework where suffering has meaning, where God has reasons for permitting evil that respect both human freedom and the value of genuine soul development. For millions, this framework makes continued belief rational despite evil's reality. Part 2. Answering divine hiddenness. Why reasonable faith requires distance. A sincere seeker prays for years but feels nothing, sees nothing, hears nothing divine. If God loves us and wants relationship, why hide? This objection seems devastating because it strikes at God's character. A loving parent wouldn't hide from their children. Yet defenders offer responses that reframe hiddenness as necessary for the very goods God seeks. The hiddenness argument claims that if a loving God existed, God would ensure all sincere seekers find sufficient evidence. We observe sincere seekers who don't find sufficient evidence. Therefore, no loving God exists. The key premise, that a loving God would make belief easy for all seekers, is precisely what defenders challenge. Consider what would change if God's existence were undeniable. Imagine God appeared publicly, performed obvious miracles, made divine presence impossible to doubt. This wouldn't just provide evidence, it would transform the entire human situation fundamentally. First, genuine faith would become impossible. Faith isn't believing despite contrary evidence, but trusting God despite uncertainty. Biblical heroes like Abraham, Job, and Peter all wrestled with doubt. Yet their faith meant something precisely because it required trust beyond certainty. If God's existence were undeniable, this dimension of faith would vanish. Second, free relationship would be compromised. When God's power and authority are overwhelmingly obvious, saying no becomes psychologically almost impossible. You might comply out of fear or pragmatic calculation rather than genuine love. God might want creatures who choose relationship freely when they could easily choose otherwise. Think about human relationships. We value being loved for ourselves, not for our power or wealth. Parents want children who love them genuinely, not children who comply out of fear. Similarly, God might value authentic relationship more than forced acknowledgement, even if this means some people never believe. Third, moral development would be stunted. Soren Kierkegaard emphasized that distance from God creates space for becoming a self, for developing authentic character. If God's presence were always obvious, we'd be like children who never leave their parents' direct supervision. Some growth requires independence, risk, the possibility of getting things wrong. Richard Swinburne argues that hiddenness enables serious choice about ultimate commitments. If God's existence were undeniable, religious choice would be trivial. Obviously, we'd align ourselves with an omnipotent being who controls our destiny. But when God's existence is uncertain, choosing to seek God, to live as if God exists, to orient your life around spiritual values, these become substantive choices that shape who you become. Critics respond, surely God could provide more evidence than we have while preserving enough uncertainty for faith. Why not make God's existence probable but not certain? Defenders reply that calibrating evidence precisely is harder than it seems. People have vastly different thresholds for belief based on background, personality, and experience. What seems obviously probable to one person remains uncertain to another. Moreover, defenders note that God has provided substantial evidence, fine-tuning of physical constants, existence of consciousness, moral law, religious experiences across cultures. Many people find this evidence compelling. That others don't might reflect not God's inadequate revelation, but human variability in weighing evidence and forming beliefs. The problem of scale presses. Surely, even accounting for variability, more people would believe if God provided clearer evidence. Why do billions live and die without ever finding God convincing? Here, defenders emphasize the noetic effects of sin, how moral rebellion distorts cognition, making people resistant to evidence of God's existence. This isn't blaming victims. It recognizes that humans have powerful psychological motivations to avoid believing in God. We prefer autonomy to submission, self-determination to accountability, moral relativism to objective standards. These preferences can unconsciously bias how we evaluate evidence, what we find plausible, which objections we find devastating. Paul wrote in Romans that God's existence is evident from creation, but people suppress this truth. From the inside, this suppression doesn't feel like active resistance, but like reasonable skepticism. We're not consciously aware of motivated reasoning. But defenders argue our moral preferences significantly shape our epistemic judgments about God. The demographic objection remains. If billions in non-Christian cultures never encounter Christian claims, how is their non-belief their fault? Defenders distinguish between rejecting God and not believing in God. Those who never hear about Christ aren't necessarily rejecting anything. Many theologians argue God judges people based on the light they received, not light they never saw. Furthermore, defenders argue that God can reveal himself through general revelation, nature, conscience, reason, not just special revelation in Scripture. Someone who responds to moral law written on their heart, who seeks ultimate truth and goodness, despite never hearing Christian teaching, might be responding to God's universal self-disclosure. The hiddenness that enables faith also enables hypocrisy to flourish. If God remains hidden, people can claim divine authorization for their own preferences, leading to religious conflict and oppression. Defenders acknowledge this cost, but argue that preventing it would require constant divine intervention that eliminates human freedom and responsibility. Think about parenting. Good parents allow children increasing independence, despite knowing kids will make mistakes, sometimes harmful ones. They don't hover constantly preventing every error. Similarly, God's hiddenness reflects respect for human agency and maturation, even when we abuse that freedom. Michael Murray argues that hiddenness serves other goods too. It enables atonement to be free grace rather than pragmatic calculation. If God's existence and judgment were undeniable, believing and following God would be self-interested survival strategy. But when God's existence is uncertain, responding to Christ becomes pure grace, accepting love offered despite uncertainty, trusting goodness beyond proof. The distribution of belief remains puzzling. Why do some sincere seekers find God while others don't? Defenders offer several considerations. First, Finding God isn't purely intellectual. It involves will, heart, openness, sometimes moral transformation that enables new perception. Second, God might have timing known only to divine wisdom. Third, even temporary non-belief might serve someone's ultimate spiritual development. Can these responses satisfy everyone? Certainly not. The person who sought God desperately for decades without finding won't find these abstractions comforting. Defenders acknowledge this pain while maintaining that God has sufficient reasons for hiddenness that serve goods we value: freedom, faith, authentic relationship, moral development. The hiddenness argument doesn't refute God's existence, but it presses defenders to explain how hiddenness serves love. The responses we've examined show why millions find continued belief rational, because the distance God maintains isn't indifference, but pedagogy, not absence, but respect for human agency, not abandonment, but the necessary condition for the very goods God seeks: genuine faith, free love, authentic character. Part 3. Answering religious diversity, from problem to confirmation. 3 billion Christians, 2 billion Muslims, 1 billion Hindus, and millions following other traditions, all claiming truth, many contradicting each other. How can any claim to unique truth when others with equal sincerity believe differently? Yet defenders reframe diversity not as refutation, but as expectation, even confirmation of theism. The diversity argument claims that contradictory religious beliefs across cultures suggest religion reflects human invention rather than divine revelation. If God revealed truth, we'd expect convergence, not contradiction. The fact that your beliefs largely depend on where you were born undermines confidence that any tradition has truth. Defenders begin by challenging the premise that diversity undermines truth. Science displays tremendous diversity. Physicists disagree about quantum interpretation, cosmologists about universe's ultimate fate, biologists about various evolutionary mechanisms. Yet no one concludes science is mere cultural invention. Disagreement indicates difficulty, not futility. Religious questions involve ultimate reality, infinite transcendence, the divine nature. These are plausibly the hardest questions possible. We should expect disagreement to persist even among sincere truth seekers. The absence of consensus doesn't mean there's no truth to be found, just that the truth is difficult to discern with certainty. Furthermore, defenders note substantial convergence beneath apparent differences. Nearly all religious traditions affirm transcendent reality beyond the physical, moral law that binds humans, life's ultimate purpose involving alignment with higher reality, and the importance of virtues like compassion, justice, and wisdom. The deep agreement on basics suggests common insight into truth rather than arbitrary invention. The contradictions seem most severe on specifics: Christ's divinity, Muhammad's prophethood, reincarnation, monotheism versus polytheism. But defenders argue that different traditions might be like blind people examining an elephant. Each grasps partial truth about transcendent reality that exceeds any tradition's complete comprehension. This doesn't require full-scale pluralism, claiming all religions are equally true. Christianity might be most fully true, while Islam and Hinduism contain genuine insights mixed with errors. Just as Newtonian physics contain truth, despite being superseded by relativity, other traditions might capture aspects of truth, despite not being complete. Critics object that this seems patronizing, telling other religions they're partially right, but Christianity has the full picture. Defenders acknowledge the tension. but note that every position that claims truth must judge other positions as less adequate. Even pluralism judges exclusivists as wrong about exclusivism. You can't avoid making judgments about competing claims without abandoning rational thought entirely. The geographic objection presses: if you were born in Pakistan, you'd likely be Muslim. Born in India, Hindu. Born in Alabama, Christian. This suggests belief depends more on location than truth. Defenders make several responses. First, this genetic fallacy confuses how we came to belief with whether belief is justified. Everything we believe is influenced by culture, geography, and upbringing, including beliefs about science, morality, and reason itself. If geographic influence undermines religion, it undermines everything. Second, the objection proves too much. If geographic diversity of belief undermines religious truth, then geographic diversity in moral beliefs, and there is substantial diversity, would undermine moral truth. But most skeptics want to maintain moral realism while rejecting religious realism. The reasoning should apply equally to both or to neither. Third, defenders note that many believers have examined alternatives and converted from their birth religion. The very skeptics making this argument often grew up religious, but rejected it after examination. If geography determined belief, these conversions wouldn't happen. The fact that people can transcend their cultural conditioning suggests our beliefs aren't merely products of location. Fourth, even if geography influences belief distribution, this doesn't show which beliefs are true. If God exists and revelation occurred in specific historical contexts, we'd expect geographic clustering around those contexts initially, with beliefs spreading through cultural transmission. The pattern we observe matches what we'd expect if historical revelations occurred. Alvin Plantinga argues that the diversity objection has an inverse problem. If one religion is true, we should expect exactly what we observe: truth competing with error, with both spreading through cultural mechanisms. If Christianity is true, we should expect people born in Christian contexts to have advantage in recognizing truth, just as people born near Galileo had advantage in recognizing heliocentrism. The problem of inconsistent revelations asks why God would allow false religions to flourish. Why not ensure only truth spreads? Defenders respond that this assumes God values correct belief above all else. But if God values freedom, authentic seeking, wrestling with truth, and ultimate relationship more than coerced correct belief, then allowing diverse traditions makes sense. Think about education. Good teachers don't just tell students answers, but create environments where students can discover truth themselves, make mistakes, learn from error. Similarly, God might value humanity's messy journey toward truth more than imposed orthodoxy. Furthermore, false religious traditions might contain enough truth to guide people toward genuine goods, while incomplete truth creates hunger for fuller revelation. Islamic emphasis on divine sovereignty and transcendence contains truth that can point Muslims toward the Christian God. Hindu insights into spiritual discipline and reality's ultimate unity contain truth that can prepare Hindus for deeper understanding. The problem of salvation in other religions seems most pressing. If Christianity is true and salvation requires faith in Christ, what about sincere Buddhists, Muslims, and Hindus? Defenders offer several responses. Inclusivist Christians argue that Christ's sacrifice potentially saves those who never heard the gospel if they respond to whatever divine light they received. God judges hearts, not mere verbal profession. Someone who follows conscience and seeks ultimate truth, despite never hearing of Jesus, might be responding to Christ implicitly. This isn't universalism claiming everyone is saved regardless. It's recognizing that God's grace might extend through means we don't fully understand to those who would have believed had they encountered the gospel. C.S. Lewis suggested this in the Chronicles of Narnia. Those who serve Aslan unknowingly through serving truth and goodness belong to Aslan, even if they don't know his name. Critics object, this makes evangelism pointless and Scripture unclear about salvation's requirements. Defenders respond that even if some are saved without hearing, many aren't, making evangelism vitally important. Moreover, explicit knowledge of Christ provides assurance, community, and fullness of relationship that general revelation cannot. The demographic objection that most humans historically lacked opportunity to hear the gospel presses defenders to explain divine justice. How is it fair if salvation depends on geographic and historical lottery? Defenders emphasize that God's justice isn't like human, judicial systems that must treat everyone identically. God can tailor judgment to individual circumstances while being perfectly just. Moreover, even those who never heard of Christ encountered moral law, conscience, creation's testimony, and opportunities for seeking ultimate truth. Those who respond to these universal revelations with humility and openness position themselves for whatever further truth God might reveal, whether in this life or beyond. The diversity of Christianity itself, thousands of denominations disagreeing on fundamental issues, seems to confirm the diversity objection. If the Holy Spirit guides believers into truth, why such fragmentation? Defenders acknowledge this as a genuine scandal requiring humility about human interpretation, even of divine revelation. Yet even Christian diversity shows convergence on essentials: Christ's divinity, resurrection, salvation through grace, scriptural authority, while disagreeing on secondary issues. The core remains remarkably stable despite 2,000 years of geographical spread and cultural adaptation. Religious diversity is real and raises genuine challenges, but defenders show why it doesn't refute theism or Christianity specifically. Diversity is what we should expect for questions about infinite transcendent reality. It confirms, rather than contradicts, that humans across cultures encounter genuine divine reality that exceeds any tradition's complete comprehension. Part 4. Answering the argument from evil design. When imperfection points beyond nature, the recurrent laryngeal nerve loops unnecessarily around the aorta. The human spine wasn't designed for upright posture. Our eyes are wired backwards. Critics cite these as proof against intelligent design. An omniscient designer wouldn't make such obvious mistakes. Yet defenders offer responses that transform apparent flaws into evidence for design. The key mistake in the poor design argument is assuming an omniscient designer would optimize every isolated component. But systems engineering requires trade-offs, constraints, and compromises that make local suboptimality necessary for global optimality. Consider the recurrent laryngeal nerve. Yes, it takes a circuitous route in adult giraffes, but it takes this route because of developmental constraints. The nerve forms early in embryonic development when the heart is near the head. As the body elongates, the nerve gets stretched, maintaining its original path. Changing this would require fundamentally redesigning developmental pathways in ways that might compromise other systems. An engineer designing a car might place the gas tank in a suboptimal location because other constraints, chassis structure, crash safety, passenger space, limit options. The gas tank's placement might seem foolish in isolation, but makes sense given competing requirements. Similarly, biological flaws might reflect necessary trade-offs given developmental and physiological constraints. The backwards retina provides another example. Critics note that cephalopod eyes have their retinas oriented correctly with photoreceptors facing incoming light. But the backwards mammalian retina enables the retinal pigment epithelium to absorb stray light, reducing glare and scattered light that would degrade image quality. It also allows the rich blood supply needed by metabolically active photoreceptors to be positioned away from the light path. Furthermore, the blind spot created by the optic nerve's exit point is functionally eliminated by neural processing. Your brain fills in the gap seamlessly. The entire visual system is optimized, not just individual components. Judging retinal orientation in isolation misses this system's level optimization. The human spine's vulnerability to back pain reflects trade-offs necessary for upright posture, large brains, and bipedal locomotion. A spine optimized purely for load-bearing would sacrifice mobility. A pelvis optimized purely for bipedalism would make childbirth even more difficult. The design represents compromises among competing requirements that together enable the distinctly human capacities we value. Defenders also challenge the assumption that an omnipotent designer must create perfect organisms. Perhaps God values creating through secondary causes, natural law, developmental processes, evolutionary mechanisms, even though this constrains outcomes. Creating through law-governed processes has value beyond creating through constant miraculous intervention. Why? Because law-governed processes enable genuine causation, discovery, science, and creature autonomy. If God constantly intervened to optimize every component, the world would lack the rational intelligibility that makes science possible. The regularities we rely on, developmental constraints, physical laws, functional trade-offs, are features, not bugs. Moreover, optimization for one environment or lifestyle necessarily means sub-optimization for others. Human bodies are optimized for certain ecological niches, lifestyles, and capacities. They're sub-optimized for others. This is true for any finite organism. Perfect optimization for everything is impossible given physical constraints. The problem of vestigial structures, appendix, tailbone, wisdom teeth, seems stronger. These appear to be evolutionary leftovers serving no function. But defenders note that many supposedly vestigial structures have been discovered to serve functions. The appendix houses beneficial bacteria and plays roles in immune function. The tailbone anchors important muscles and ligaments. Even genuinely non-functional structures don't necessarily indicate poor design if they're byproducts of functional developmental programs. The developmental pathway that produces other valuable structures might necessarily produce the vestigial structure as side effect. Removing it might require redesigning the entire pathway in ways that compromise the structures you want. Think about bridge construction. Engineers build scaffolding that serves temporary purpose but becomes unnecessary once the bridge is complete. Is the scaffolding poor design? No, it enables building the bridge. Similarly, developmental structures that become vestigial in adults might serve essential roles during development. The argument from junk DNA faces similar responses. 98% of human DNA doesn't code for proteins. Critics cite this as waste inconsistent with intelligent design. But recent research discovered that much junk DNA serves regulatory functions, controlling when and where genes are expressed. The proportion of functional non-coding DNA keeps rising as we understand genetic regulation better. Even genuinely non-functional DNA might serve purposes we don't yet understand, or might be necessary byproducts of the replication mechanisms that enable functional DNA to copy itself reliably. The complexity of genetic systems means components that seem wasteful in isolation might be necessary for the system's overall function. Defenders emphasize methodological problems with the poor design argument. Critics are in the position of looking at a sophisticated machine they don't fully understand and declaring components useless or poorly arranged. This requires comprehensive knowledge of the system's constraints, requirements, and optimization criteria, knowledge we often lack. Furthermore, the poor design argument proves too much. If apparent suboptimality refutes design, then evolutionary biology must be false because evolution produces countless suboptimal designs through path-dependent processes. Yet critics accept evolution. This reveals that suboptimality doesn't actually refute a process creating organisms. It just refutes direct divine intervention, creating each organism with no constraints. Theistic evolution accepts that God created through evolutionary processes. This makes apparent poor design perfectly consistent with intelligent design. God designed the system that produces organisms through natural selection, and natural selection produces exactly the kinds of functional but imperfect designs we observe. Critics respond that if God used evolution, God could have guided it to better outcomes. But this assumes we know what outcomes are better given all constraints and purposes. Maybe the human spine's vulnerability serves purposes, building character through dealing with limitation, driving medical innovation, creating opportunities for empathy and care. We can't assume we know the optimization criteria God would use. The strongest design arguments don't rest on biological complexity anyway, but on cosmic fine-tuning of physical constants, which faces no analogous objection. The poor design argument, at most, suggests God created through law-governed processes rather than direct intervention, a position many theists gladly accept. Ultimately, the poor design argument commits the same error as the design argument it opposes, assuming we can read the designer's intentions and capabilities off the product. Both atheists and theists agree organisms show functional complexity arising from natural processes. The disagreement is whether those natural processes themselves reflect design. Part 5. Answering arguments from science. When natural explanations point to design, science explains lightning without Zeus, disease without demons, reproduction without vital forces. Each gap filled by natural explanation seems to eliminate God's role. Yet defenders argue that scientific success confirms rather than contradicts theism, because theism predicts a rational, law-governed cosmos amenable to scientific investigation. The God of the Gaps accusation claims religious believers historically invoked God to explain natural phenomena, thunder, earthquakes, consciousness. But science progressively explains these through natural mechanisms, pushing God into ever-shrinking gaps. Eventually, no gaps remain requiring God. Defenders first note that this characterization is historically inaccurate. Modern science emerged primarily from Christian Europe precisely because Christian theology emphasized God's rational creation through law. Medieval scholars expected nature to be intelligible because God created through wisdom, not arbitrary whim. Francis Bacon, Isaac Newton, Johannes Kepler, Robert Boyle, founders of modern science, were explicitly theistic, seeing their work as discovering God's design. They didn't view natural explanations as competing with divine explanation, but as revealing God's methods. Understanding mechanism doesn't eliminate designer, it reveals designer's ingenuity. The supposed conflict between natural and divine explanation rests on a category confusion. Natural explanations answer how questions. How do planets orbit? How does lightning form? How do organisms adapt? Theological explanations answer why questions. Why does nature follow laws? Why does anything exist? Why are we capable of understanding it? These are complementary, not competitive. Imagine finding a watch on a beach. Discovering the physical mechanism, gears, springs, escapement, doesn't eliminate the watchmaker. It reveals how the watchmaker accomplished their purpose. Similarly, discovering physical mechanisms doesn't eliminate God, but reveals how God creates and sustains nature. Critics respond that this saves theology from refutation by making it unfalsifiable. If natural explanations never count against God, then God explains nothing. But defenders reply that God explains the framework within which natural explanations work: existence itself, laws of nature, rationality of cosmos, fine-tuning of constants, not gaps within that framework. Think of levels of explanation. Neurochemistry explains depression in terms of serotonin levels. Evolutionary psychology explains depression in terms of adaptive responses. Sociology explains depression in terms of social factors. These don't compete, but address different levels. Theology addresses the deepest level: why minds exist that can be depressed, why natural laws enable neurochemistry, why reality has the structure making all this possible. The methodological naturalism of science, seeking natural explanations without invoking supernatural causes, doesn't require metaphysical naturalism, the claim that only natural things exist. Science's methodological restriction makes it successful within its domain, but doesn't show that domain exhausts reality. Imagine archaeologists studying ancient civilizations. They use naturalistic methods: carbon dating, artifact analysis, cultural comparison. They don't invoke divine intervention to explain pottery styles or tool development. But this methodological naturalism doesn't mean ancient people didn't believe in gods, or that religious belief played no role in their societies. The method works within its domain without exhausting reality. Similarly, science's naturalistic methodology succeeds wonderfully for understanding physical mechanisms. But this doesn't show that physical mechanisms exhaust reality. The success of science studying nature doesn't prove there's nothing beyond nature any more than archaeology's success studying civilizations proves there's nothing beyond culture. The fine-tuning argument shows how science itself points beyond naturalism. Physics reveals physical constants calibrated with stunning precision necessary for life. The cosmological constant must be accurate to 1 part in 10^120. The strong nuclear force must fall within a narrow range. These aren't explained by any current physical theory. They appear as arbitrary parameters that could have been otherwise. Naturalists respond with multiverse theories. If countless universes exist with different constants, ours is not surprising because we necessarily observe a life-permitting universe. But critics note that multiverse theories themselves require fine-tuning of meta-laws generating universes. You've pushed the question back one level without eliminating it. Moreover, multiverse theories are themselves speculative. They're not established science, but proposals attempting to explain fine-tuning without design. If we're willing to accept speculative theories to avoid theism, this suggests motivated reasoning rather than following evidence where it leads. Consciousness presents another challenge to naturalism. Subjective experience, the redness of red, the painfulness of pain, the what it's like of being you, resists physical explanation. We can map neural correlates of consciousness, but not explain why neural activity produces subjective experience. This is the hard problem. Physicalists argue consciousness must be physical, because we have no evidence for non-physical entities. But defenders respond that consciousness itself is evidence for non-physical reality. We know subjective experience exists with absolute certainty, more certain than we know about electrons or quantum fields. If physicalism can't accommodate this most certain datum, the problem lies with physicalism, not consciousness. Evolutionary explanations for consciousness face similar difficulties. Evolution explains behaviors, capabilities, functional organization, but it doesn't explain why these are accompanied by subjective experience. A philosophical zombie, a being functionally identical to you, but lacking subjective experience, would be equally fit evolutionarily. So why aren't we zombies? The fact that consciousness emerged suggests reality has the resources to produce minds, which sits more comfortably with theism than materialism. If the ultimate reality is mental, God, then finite minds emerging from it makes sense. If the ultimate reality is mindless particles, minds emerging from it is profoundly puzzling. The origin of life remains unexplained despite decades of research. We don't know how non-living chemistry became self-replicating, information encoding, metabolism-maintaining systems. Various scenarios have been proposed. RNA world, metabolism first, clay minerals, but none is confirmed or clearly superior to alternatives. Defenders don't rest their case on this ignorance, but they note the pattern. The more we learn about life's requirements, the more improbable its chance emergence appears. DNA encodes information using arbitrary conventions, like language. Information systems we understand always reflect intelligence. The origin of biological information remains deeply puzzling on naturalistic assumptions. The mathematical structure of physical law also points beyond mere nature. Why is the universe governed by elegant mathematical laws? Eugene Wigner called this the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics. Why should nature conform to human-discovered mathematics? Einstein expressed amazement that the universe is comprehensible through math. Theism provides an explanation. God created through mathematical logic and created minds capable of grasping that logic. Naturalism faces the puzzle of why mindless processes would produce physical laws that match mathematical structures that minds can comprehend. The fit seems too perfect to be accidental. Quantum mechanics raises additional questions. The role of observation in quantum mechanics, the non-locality of entangled particles, the fine-tuning required for quantum fields to produce stable atoms. All these suggest reality is weirder, less purely material than classical physics assumed. Defenders don't claim quantum mechanics proves theism, but they argue it undermines confident materialism. Reality at its foundation appears observer-dependent, interconnected, governed by abstract laws for reasons we don't understand. This is at least as compatible with theistic idealism as with materialistic naturalism. Science has been spectacularly successful explaining natural phenomena, but its success doesn't eliminate God. It fulfills the expectation that a rational God would create a rational, law-governed cosmos amenable to scientific study. The deepest questions, why anything exists, why nature follows laws, why consciousness emerges, why life's information arose, why mathematics describes reality, all remain unanswered by science while finding natural explanations in theism. Part 6. Answering logical paradoxes. When apparent contradictions dissolve, can God create a stone so heavy God can't lift it? Can God know future free choices? Can three persons be one being? Critics wield logical paradoxes like weapons to show God's concept is incoherent, that traditional divine attributes contradict each other or logic itself. Yet defenders dissolve these apparent contradictions through careful analysis. The omnipotence paradox. Can God create an unliftable stone? Seems to prove omnipotence is impossible. If God can create such a stone, then God can't lift it, so God isn't omnipotent. If God can't create it, God again isn't omnipotent. Either way, omnipotence fails. The solution lies in defining omnipotence properly. Omnipotence means power to do anything logically possible, not anything whatsoever. God can't create square circles or married bachelors because these involve logical contradictions. They describe impossible states of affairs, not difficult tasks. An unliftable stone for an omnipotent being is like a square circle. It's not a coherent concept. The phrase, stone that an omnipotent being can't lift, is self-contradictory when you unpack it. You're asking whether God can create something whose existence contradicts God's nature. This is asking whether God can both exist and not exist simultaneously. Obvious nonsense. Think about it differently. Omnipotence means having all powers. Creating an unliftable stone would require losing the power to lift all stones. But losing power contradicts omnipotence. So the ability to create an unliftable stone isn't actually a power, it's a disability. God not having disabilities doesn't limit omnipotence. Critics respond that this seems like special pleading, but defenders note we use similar reasoning elsewhere. We don't say humans lack the ability to be married bachelors. We say the concept is incoherent. Similarly, God not doing the logically impossible doesn't limit God's power any more than not doing the morally wrong limits God's goodness. The divine foreknowledge paradox seems harder. If God knows infallibly what you'll choose tomorrow, can you choose otherwise? It seems not. If God knows you'll choose A, and God can't be wrong, then you must choose A. God's foreknowledge appears to eliminate freedom. Defenders offer multiple solutions. First, knowledge doesn't cause what's known. I know the sun rose this morning, but my knowledge didn't cause the sunrise. Similarly, God knowing your future choice doesn't cause it. You'll choose freely, and God knows what you'll freely choose. The necessity is conditional. If you choose it, it must happen. Not absolute. It must happen regardless of your choice. Second, God exists eternally, outside time. God doesn't know future events from the past, but experiences all time simultaneously in eternal present. From God's eternal perspective, your tomorrow is present, not future. God directly observes your free choice as it happens eternally, not predicting it from the past. Think of a parade. People on the ground see one section at a time. Someone in a helicopter sees the whole parade simultaneously. The helicopter observer doesn't see the parade's future. They see all of it in one eternal present. Similarly, God sees your whole life eternally present, not predicting future from past, but observing it all simultaneously. Third, some defenders embrace open theism. God knows the past and present perfectly, but future free choices remain open, unknowable even to God, because they don't exist yet to be known. This preserves both omniscience, God knows all truths, and freedom. Future choices aren't yet true or false. Critics object, this limits God's knowledge. Defenders respond that knowing all truths doesn't require knowing truths that don't exist. If future free choices aren't yet true or false, God's not knowing them doesn't limit omniscience any more than not knowing married bachelors limits omniscience. The Trinity paradox, 3 persons, 1 being, seems like blatant contradiction. 3 isn't 1, 1 isn't 3. How can Christians claim God is 3 and 1 without violating logic? Defenders emphasize that Trinitarian theology claims 3 persons in 1 being, not 3 persons in 1 person, or 3 beings in 1 being. Person and being are different categories. You can have 3 of one category in 1 of another without contradiction, just as you can have 3 angles in 1 triangle. The key is understanding what person and being mean in Trinitarian theology. Technical terms with specific meanings, not everyday usage. Critics respond that this just pushes the problem back. What does it mean for 3 persons to share 1 being? Defenders acknowledge mystery, but deny contradiction. We don't fully understand how the Trinity works, but we can show the doctrine doesn't violate logic. Not understanding something fully doesn't mean it's contradictory. Think about quantum mechanics. Particles behaving as both waves and particles seems contradictory until you understand the technical meaning of wave-particle duality. Similarly, 3 persons in 1 being seems contradictory until you understand the technical theology. We're not saying 301, but that God's nature involves a particular kind of complexity that our simplified categories don't capture perfectly. The problem of God knowing contingent truths also creates puzzles. God knows today is Monday on Monday, and today is Tuesday on Tuesday. Has God's knowledge changed? If yes, God is mutable. If no, how does God know what day it is? Defenders respond using the eternal present solution. God doesn't know today is Monday, but rather, Monday is located at temporal coordinate t. This knowledge never changes. Alternatively, defenders distinguish between God's essential knowledge and God's free knowledge. God's essential knowledge of necessary truths never changes. God's free knowledge of contingent truths reflects God's free decisions to create certain things. This knowledge can change in our temporal perspective while remaining eternally complete in God's perspective. The divine simplicity doctrine, God has no parts and is identical with his attributes, creates the paradox that if God is identical with justice and identical with mercy, then justice is identical with mercy, which seems false. Defenders respond that God's nature is simple, but our concepts are multiple. Justice and mercy name the same simple divine essence from different aspectual perspectives. Think about water. H2O is simple at molecular level, but we use different words, liquid, ice, steam, to capture different aspects of how it appears under different conditions. Similarly, God's nature is utterly simple, but we use multiple terms to capture different aspects of how that simple nature relates to creation. Critics argue all these responses either water down divine attributes to avoid contradiction or embrace mystery in ways that make God incomprehensible. Defenders respond that some mystery is appropriate given God's transcendence. We should expect that infinite divine nature exceeds our finite concept's ability to capture perfectly. But mystery differs from contradiction. Contradiction is claiming something is both true and false simultaneously. Mystery is acknowledging that we don't fully understand how something can be true. Trinitarian theology is mysterious. We don't fully grasp how three persons are one being. But it's not contradictory. We can show the doctrine doesn't involve simultaneously affirming and denying the same proposition. The incarnation creates special difficulties. How can one person be fully God and fully human when God is immutable and humans change? God is omniscient and humans learn. God is omnipotent and humans are weak. Defenders use the two natures doctrine. Christ has divine and human natures united in one person. The divine nature possesses all divine attributes: omniscience, omnipotence, immutability. The human nature possesses all human attributes: learning, growing, physical limitations. These natures are united without mixture or confusion in one person. The person experiences both nature's attributes in appropriate ways for each nature. Critics object, this seems like splitting Christ into two persons. Defenders respond that person and nature are different. A person is a subject of experiences and actions. A nature is the set of properties and capacities that person possesses. Christ is one person, experiencing and acting through two distinct natures. Think about human persons who have both mind and body. We speak of mental properties and physical properties without splitting ourselves into two persons. Similarly, Christ has divine and human properties without splitting into two persons. The analogy is imperfect, but it shows that one person with two natures isn't obviously contradictory. The logical paradoxes don't refute God's existence or coherence. They press defenders to clarify concepts, refine definitions, and acknowledge mystery where appropriate. The centuries of careful theological and philosophical work have produced responses that millions find satisfying, not because they eliminate all difficulty, but because they show these paradoxes aren't genuine contradictions, but puzzles arising from our limited concepts encountering infinite reality. Part 7. Answering moral arguments against God. When the Euthyphro cuts both ways. If God commands something, is it good because God commands it, or does God command it because it's good? This ancient dilemma supposedly shows morality is either arbitrary, if the former, or independent of God, if the latter. Either way, God doesn't ground morality. Yet defenders argue this dilemma rests on false dichotomy, and that divine nature theory provides a third option. The Euthyphro dilemma seems devastating. If things are good merely because God commands them, then God could command torture and make it good. Morality becomes arbitrary divine whim. But if God commands things because they're antecedently good, then goodness exists independently and God merely recognizes it. God isn't needed for morality. Divine nature theory threads between these horns. Things aren't good because God commands them, nor does God command them because of some external standard. Rather, God's nature is the good, and God commands what flows from the divine nature. God commands love because God is love. God forbids cruelty because cruelty contradicts God's essentially compassionate nature. Think about water and H2O. We don't say water is H2O because of some external fact making it so, nor that H2O just happens to be water arbitrarily. Water's nature is identical with H2O. Similarly, goodness isn't external to God. It's God's very nature. God doesn't conform to goodness. God is goodness itself. Critics object. This seems to just relocate the question. Why is God's nature good rather than evil? If there's no answer, we're back to arbitrariness. If there is an answer, we're appealing to standards beyond God. Defenders respond that God's nature is essentially good, necessarily so, as a matter of metaphysical necessity, like 2 + 2 = 4. Some truths don't have explanations beyond themselves. They're ultimate, foundational, the stopping point of explanation. God is good is one such truth. It's not arbitrary, because God couldn't be otherwise while remaining God. But it's not dependent on external standards either. God is the ultimate standard. The arbitrariness worry cuts both ways. If objective morality exists independently of God, where does it come from? Abstract moral truths just floating free, obligating people through some mysterious mechanism? That seems more metaphysically puzzling than grounding morality in the ultimate personal reality who created persons capable of moral experience. Furthermore, obligation, the feeling that we ought to do something, makes sense if there's a personal authority commanding us. Impersonal moral truths don't create obligations. Abstract propositions can't command. Only persons can create moral duties in the full sense of obligation to someone or something beyond ourselves. Critics bring up the problem of God commanding seemingly immoral acts in Scripture. Genocide in Canaan, Abraham nearly sacrificing Isaac, animal sacrifices. If God commands these, doesn't this prove divine command theory makes atrocities permissible? Defenders offer multiple responses depending on theological commitments. Some argue these difficult passages require careful interpretation. Genocide commands might be hyperbolic ancient warfare rhetoric, not literal commands to kill everyone. Abraham's test showed his faith, while God always intended to prevent the sacrifice. Animal sacrifices had pedagogical purposes in ancient context that modern readers miss. Others embrace divine command theory more directly. If God genuinely commanded these acts, they were morally right in those contexts, even if they'd be wrong now for us. God's greater knowledge and authority means God can command things that would be wrong if we did them on our own initiative. Just as parents can command children to do things children shouldn't do without permission. Critics find this disturbing. It seems to make anything permissible if God commands it. Defenders emphasize that God's nature constrains what God can command. God, being perfectly loving and just, would never command genuine evil. The difficult cases either aren't what they seem or reflect circumstances we don't fully understand. The evolutionary debunking argument claims that if our moral beliefs arose through evolutionary processes selected for survival rather than truth, we have no reason to trust them. Our belief that murder is wrong reflects evolutionary pressures favoring cooperation, not moral truth. This debunking argument undermines moral realism. Defenders respond that theism avoids this debunking problem. If God created us and designed evolution to produce beings capable of moral knowledge, then evolution can be God's method of giving us reliable moral perception. Our moral faculties track moral truth because God designed them to do so. Without God, the debunking argument is powerful. Why trust faculties selected purely for survival to track truth? But with God, evolution and moral knowledge are compatible. The evolutionary story explains the mechanism of how we came to have moral knowledge, while theism explains why that mechanism is reliable. Furthermore, the debunking argument is self-defeating for naturalists. If evolutionary processes selected our cognitive faculties purely for survival rather than truth, why trust any of our beliefs, including beliefs about evolution? The argument that undermines moral belief also undermines scientific belief. Naturalism cuts off the branch it sits on. The problem of moral disagreement supposedly shows morality isn't objective because people across cultures disagree about right and wrong. But defenders note that disagreement exists in science, history, and philosophy too, without undermining objectivity there. Disagreement indicates difficulty, not subjectivity. Moreover, much moral disagreement results from factual disagreements rather than different moral principles. Cultures that practiced human sacrifice believed, falsely, that gods demanded it to prevent disasters. They valued human life, but had false beliefs about how to protect it. The disagreement was factual, not moral. Deep moral agreement exists across cultures on basics: prohibitions against murder, theft, and betrayal within the group, positive duties of care toward family, and reciprocity toward friends. The variation occurs in application and scope, not in fundamental principles. The grounding objection asks how abstract moral truths could obligate concrete persons. Even if moral truths exist, how do they get purchase on us? Why should we care what some abstract truth says? Defenders argue this is precisely where God matters. Moral truths aren't just abstract. They're grounded in the personal God who created us and to whom we're accountable. Think about laws. Civil laws exist as abstract rules, but they obligate us because there's a legal system with authority enforcing them. Similarly, moral laws obligate because there's a moral lawgiver with authority over us. Without the lawgiver, moral truths become suggestions we can take or leave. The moral argument for God's existence actually runs both directions. Critics use euthyphro to challenge theistic morality, but defenders use moral experience to support God's existence. The fact that objective moral values and duties exist, that we experience genuine obligation, that morality involves more than preference, all this supports theism better than naturalism. The moral arguments against God fail because they present false dichotomies and ignore divine nature theory. The apparent tension between God's commands and moral truth dissolves when we understand that God's nature is the good, that God's commands express that nature necessarily, and that moral obligation makes sense only if there's a personal moral authority. Far from undermining theism, moral experience confirms it. Part 8. Answering historical skepticism. When testimony matters, the resurrection never happened. Gospel contradictions prove unreliability. Religious texts are no different from mythology. Historical skepticism supposedly undermines Christianity's foundations. Yet defenders argue that applying normal historical methods to religious claims supports rather than refutes key Christian claims. The resurrection seems most vulnerable to historical skepticism. Dead people stay dead. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. We have only ancient texts written by believers decades after the event. How can this establish literal bodily resurrection? Defenders begin with facts virtually all historical scholars, including skeptics, accept based on standard historical methodology. First, Jesus was crucified and died. Second, Jesus' followers had experiences they interpreted as resurrection appearances. Third, these experiences transformed them from frightened, scattered disciples into bold proclaimers willing to die for their message. Fourth, Christianity spread rapidly from Jerusalem, where Jesus died. These facts need explanation. The resurrection hypothesis explains them perfectly. Jesus died, rose bodily from death, appeared to disciples, transforming them and launching the Christian movement. But skeptics propose naturalistic alternatives: hallucination, legend, theft of body, swoon theory. Jesus didn't actually die. Defenders argue each alternative faces fatal problems. Hallucination theory fails because multiple people saw Jesus simultaneously. Hallucinations are private, individual experiences. Paul reports Jesus appearing to 500 people at once. Groups don't share identical hallucinations. Moreover, hallucinations don't produce physical interactions like eating and touching reported in Gospels. Legend theory fails because insufficient time elapsed for legendary development. Paul's letters, written 15 to 25 years after Jesus, already contain resurrection claims. Creeds quoted in Paul's letters likely formed within 5 years. This is far too soon for legend to replace memory among eyewitnesses who could correct false reports. Furthermore, legend develops in predictable ways. Stories grow more fantastic. Contradictions get harmonized. Details multiply. But early resurrection accounts are restrained. Include details that seem embarrassing if inventing women as first witnesses in a culture that discounted women's testimony, and remain multiply, attested in independent sources without obvious legendary development. Theft of body theory fails because it requires disciples knowingly perpetuating a lie. But people don't die for lies they know are false. The disciples faced persecution, imprisonment, and martyrdom for proclaiming resurrection. If they stole the body and knew the resurrection was false, at least some would have recanted under pressure. None did. Some suggest disciples sincerely believed despite being wrong. They wanted Jesus alive so badly they convinced themselves. But this fails to explain the empty tomb. If Jesus' body remained buried, authorities would produce it to refute resurrection claims. They never did, despite strong motivation. Christianity emerged in Jerusalem, where the tomb was accessible. If the body was still there, the movement dies immediately. Swoon theory, Jesus survived crucifixion, fails because Roman crucifixion was efficiently lethal. Jesus was flogged, crucified for hours, stabbed with spear. Even if he somehow survived, he'd be in no condition to appear powerful and victorious enough to convince disciples he'd conquered death. A half-dead Jesus limping from a tomb inspires pity, not worship. Critics respond that we shouldn't believe extraordinary claims based on ancient texts by biased witnesses. We don't believe Homer's gods existed despite ancient texts attesting them. Why treat Gospels differently? Defenders note crucial differences. Gospel writers weren't writing mythological fiction, but claiming to report events their audience could verify. Luke explicitly claims careful historical investigation. John claims eyewitness testimony. Paul cites witnesses still alive who could be questioned. This is fundamentally different from obvious mythology. Furthermore, within decades of Jesus, we have multiple independent sources: Paul's letters, Gospels, Acts, attesting resurrection. For comparison, Our earliest sources for Alexander the Great were written centuries after his death. Yet historians confidently reconstruct Alexander's life. The sources for Jesus are earlier and more numerous. The criteria historians use for assessing ancient sources support gospel reliability. Multiple independent attestation. Resurrection appears in all gospel traditions. Embarrassing details. Peter's denial. Women as first witnesses suggest honesty rather than propaganda. Coherence. Resurrection fits Jesus' claims and makes sense of church origins. Critics emphasize gospel contradictions. How many angels at the tomb? Exact appearance sequences. Resurrection timing. But defenders note that eyewitness testimony always contains such variations. Perfect agreement would suggest collusion. The variations exist on peripheral details, while core facts remain consistent. Empty tomb, appearances, transformation of disciples. Think about 4 eyewitnesses describing a car accident. They'll disagree on exact timing, how many people involved, the order of events, peripheral details. But they'll agree on core facts. There was an accident. It involved certain vehicles. It happened at a particular location. Gospel differences resemble this pattern of genuine eyewitness testimony rather than legendary fabrication or careful collusion. The question isn't whether we can prove resurrection occurred. Historical method can't provide certainty about any ancient event. The question is whether resurrection is the best explanation for the accepted facts. Defenders argue it is. It explains more data more simply than alternatives. It accounts for Christianity's origin without requiring implausible auxiliary hypotheses. Furthermore, dismissing resurrection purely because resurrections don't happen begs the question against Christianity. If God exists and became incarnate, resurrection is not improbable. The prior probability of resurrection depends on whether God exists and whether Jesus was who he claimed. These are independent theological questions, not historical ones. Critics say we should apply uniform skepticism to all miracle claims, Muslim, Hindu, Mormon, not just Christian ones. But defenders note that miracle claims must be evaluated individually on their evidence. Resurrection has better attestation than most religious miracles. Early sources, multiple independent witnesses, empty tomb, transformed disciples. Compared to Joseph Smith's golden plates, we have only Smith's testimony. Plates mysteriously disappeared. Other witnesses later recanted or had strong motives to support Smith. Or compare to Hindu epics. Obviously, legendary literature written centuries after events, making no claim to eyewitness reporting. Resurrection evidence is qualitatively stronger. The historical case for resurrection doesn't stand alone. It combines with philosophical arguments for God's existence, Jesus' teachings and moral character, and personal religious experience. The cumulative case makes resurrection more plausible than isolated historical analysis suggests. Historical skepticism about religious claims fails when applied consistently. If we reject resurrection despite its evidence, we must reject much of ancient history that historians routinely accept with weaker attestation. The double standard reveals bias rather than sound methodology. Applying standard historical methods to Christian claims supports rather than undermines core historical foundations of the faith. Part 9. Answering the challenge of suffering. When pain has purpose. A child dies of cancer. A tsunami kills thousands. If God is good and powerful, why doesn't God prevent this suffering? We've examined soul-making theodicy earlier. But critics press deeper challenges requiring more nuanced responses. The question isn't just whether God has reasons, but whether those reasons justify the suffering we observe. The intensity objection argues that even if some suffering enables soul-making, the amount we observe exceeds what's necessary. Couldn't character develop through milder challenges? Must children suffer cancer? Must natural disasters kill thousands? Defenders respond that we lack the comprehensive perspective to judge what amount is necessary. First, different people require different challenges. What seems excessive to one person might be necessary for another's growth. Some people develop profound depth through tragedy that they couldn't reach through ordinary hardship. Second, the interconnectedness of events means preventing one tragedy might require preventing hundreds of preceding causes, ultimately requiring either constant intervention or not creating the world at all. Third, meaningful growth requires genuine stakes. If we knew God would prevent catastrophic suffering, this knowledge would change everything. We'd know we were essentially safe, that nothing truly horrible could happen. This safety net would eliminate the conditions for certain virtues. Profound courage requires real danger. Deep faith requires real possibility of loss. The distribution objection presses. Why do some suffer enormously while others hardly at all? If suffering serves soul-making, shouldn't it be more equitably distributed? Defenders offer several responses. First, we don't know others' private struggles. Outward ease may mask inner torment. Second, those who suffer less in one way often struggle more in others. Third, collective soul-making occurs through some people's suffering, while others respond compassionately. Think about the Good Samaritan parable. The injured man's suffering enabled the Samaritan's virtue. Without the wounded man, no opportunity for that compassion. This doesn't justify causing suffering so others can help, but it shows how God might permit suffering, partly because of how others respond, not just for the sufferer's growth. Furthermore, defenders emphasize that this life isn't the whole story. Eternity transforms the equation. 70 years of unequal suffering becomes negligible against infinite existence. The person who suffers much here might have spiritual depth and capacity for eternal joy that exceeds others. We're judging temporary inequality without seeing the eternal distribution. The innocent suffering objection, infants with disease, animals in pain, seem strongest because these victims don't grow morally from suffering. Why permit suffering that serves no soul-making purpose for the sufferer? Defenders respond that suffering can serve purposes beyond the sufferer's growth. Infant suffering enables parental and medical caregiver responses that develop their souls. Animal suffering maintains the ecosystem's functioning. Predation prevents overpopulation. Disease controls numbers. Even suffering that seems gratuitous to us might ripple through communities and generations in ways we can't trace. Moreover, animal suffering might be less intense than appears. Without self-awareness, time consciousness, and anticipation of future pain, animal experience might be purely present-focused and less distressing than it seems from outside. This isn't dismissing animal welfare, but recognizing we don't fully understand animal consciousness. The trauma objection notes that suffering often doesn't produce growth, but breaks people. PTSD, depression, loss of faith, destroyed relationships. If soul-making is the purpose, it fails spectacularly for millions. Defenders respond that free will means we can respond to suffering in growth-destroying ways. The possibility of soul-making doesn't guarantee it occurs. Furthermore, even trauma might be redeemed ultimately. Those broken by suffering in this life might receive healing and compensation eternally. The person whose life was destroyed by trauma might find that very brokenness created capacity for experiencing God's healing love that wouldn't exist otherwise. The trauma is still evil, but even it gets woven into an ultimately good story. Critics object that this makes suffering instrumental. God uses people's pain for other purposes, rather than valuing sufferers as ends in themselves. Defenders respond that God doesn't merely use suffering, but compensates sufferers so completely that they benefit personally from even their worst experiences when seen from eternity's perspective. The early death objection asks why some die young, deprived of opportunities for growth that long life provides. Defenders suggest several possibilities. First, perhaps some souls reach their optimal growth quickly, and continued earthly life would add nothing. Second, perhaps early death serves others' growth, parents, friends, communities responding to loss. Third, perhaps continued spiritual development occurs after death. The pointless suffering objection identifies cases where no discernible good results, suffering hidden from others, victims who respond destructively, pain that destroys rather than builds. Defenders emphasize our epistemic limitations. We can't see all connections and consequences. What seems pointless might enable goods we never observe or prevents evils we never imagine. Moreover, skeptical theism reminds us that if God exists, the gap between divine and human understanding is vast. We shouldn't expect to discern God's purposes in every case any more than infants should expect to understand all parental decisions. Trust in God's goodness, supported by independent arguments, justifies believing God has reasons even when we can't identify them. Critics respond, this makes God's goodness unfalsifiable. Any evidence against it gets dismissed by appealing to mystery. Defenders reply that we have positive evidence for God's goodness from other sources: moral argument, religious experience, Jesus' teachings and character. When we encounter apparently contrary evidence, our positive evidence justifies continued trust that the apparent contrary evidence isn't ultimate. Think about trusting a friend. If you've experienced their trustworthiness repeatedly, you give them benefit of doubt when circumstances seem suspicious. You don't immediately conclude they betrayed you, but trust that an explanation exists, even if you don't know it. Similarly, if we have good reasons to trust God's goodness, we can maintain that trust despite not understanding specific instances of suffering. The problem of suffering doesn't have neat answers that satisfy everyone. The mystery remains. But defenders show why millions find continued belief rational. Because soul-making provides a framework where suffering has meaning. Because free will explains much evil. Because eternal compensation transforms temporary injustice. And because trust in God's goodness, supported by independent evidence, justifies believing divine purposes exist even when opaque to us. Part 10. Living with Paradox and Mystery. After examining responses to every major objection against God's existence, a pattern emerges. For every argument against God, defenders offer responses that seem satisfying to believers but insufficient to skeptics. Neither side proves their case decisively. We're left with competing frameworks interpreting the same evidence differently. What should we make of this? First, We should recognize that uncertainty doesn't mean all positions are equally reasonable. Some arguments are stronger than others. Young Earth creationism faces overwhelming evidence against it. But sophisticated theism, philosophical atheism, and genuine agnosticism all represent intellectually defensible positions that reasonable people can adopt. The responses we've examined show that belief in God isn't irrational or intellectually dishonest. Thoughtful defenders have developed sophisticated answers to the hardest challenges. These answers don't eliminate mystery. They shouldn't, given God's transcendence. But they show that objections don't refute belief decisively. Second, we should appreciate what defenders accomplish, even when not everyone finds their responses convincing. The free will defense shows that evil and God are logically compatible, which is significant even if it doesn't solve the evidential problem. Soul-making theodicy provides meaningful framework for understanding suffering, even if mysteries remain. Divine nature theory navigates the Euthyphro dilemma, even if critics prefer other approaches. Third, the persistence of disagreement should humble both sides. If brilliant minds studying these questions for millennia haven't reached consensus, arrogance about having the final answer seems misplaced. Believers should acknowledge honest objections have force. Critics should acknowledge honest responses, address those objections thoughtfully. Fourth, these debates reveal deep truths about reason and evidence. Ultimate questions resist decisive proof because they rest on foundational intuitions that shape rather than being shaped by evidence. Whether you find soul-making theodicy satisfying depends partly on prior intuitions about what divine love requires. Whether you find design arguments convincing depends partly on intuitions about what counts as explanation. Fifth, the cumulative case matters more than individual arguments. No single response to evil, or argument for God, or biblical interpretation bears the whole weight of belief. Believers find cumulative evidence compelling. Philosophical arguments, religious experience, Scripture's wisdom, personal transformation, community support, beauty and meaning religion provides, even when individual elements face objections. Think about trusting a person. You don't trust because of one decisive proof, but because countless small evidences accumulate. Their history of honesty, their character in crisis, their care when you needed them, intuitive sense of their goodness. Similarly, religious belief rests on cumulative case rather than single proof. Sixth, the intellectual journey matters as much as conclusions. Engaging seriously with hard questions develops wisdom, humility, clarity of thought, and ability to see multiple perspectives. Whether you end up theist, atheist, or agnostic, wrestling with these issues makes you a better thinker and perhaps a better person. Seventh, existential and intellectual questions intertwine but aren't identical. You might find evil the strongest objection intellectually, yet find religious life provides meaning and community practically. You might find philosophical arguments for God convincing, yet struggle with prayer's reality. Integrating intellectual convictions with lived experience requires ongoing work. Eighth, charity toward those who disagree matters enormously. The person who believes despite your devastating objections isn't necessarily stupid or dishonest. They might weigh intuitions differently, find other evidence more compelling, or have experiences you haven't had. Similarly, the skeptic who remains unconvinced by your responses isn't necessarily rebellious or hardened. They might genuinely find objections stronger than responses. These conversations shape how billions live, govern, educate, and find meaning. Approaching them with humility, charity, and honest engagement matters more than winning arguments. The truth matters supremely, but so does how we pursue truth together across our disagreements. The responses to objections we've examined represent centuries of careful thought by brilliant minds who took challenges seriously rather than dismissing them. These responses satisfy millions while leaving others unconvinced. This isn't failure, but reflection of genuine difficulty in ultimate questions that exceed our full comprehension. Each person must ultimately decide what to believe and how to live. These responses can inform that decision by showing that objections don't settle questions decisively, that thoughtful responses exist, and that continued belief remains intellectually viable despite real challenges. Whether these responses satisfy you depends on your own intuitions, experiences, and assessment of cumulative evidence. What we can say definitively is this: the intellectual exchange between challengers and defenders produces deeper understanding of deep questions, sharper articulation of positions, and greater appreciation for why reasonable people disagree. This exchange continues not because one side dominates, but because both sides raise genuine difficulties and offer genuine insights that advance human wisdom, even without resolving debates conclusively. In the end, living well with uncertainty while pursuing truth as best we can might be all any of us can do. The responses show why millions find belief rational despite objections. Whether those responses should convince you depends on your own wrestling with these timeless questions that every generation faces anew. Part 11. Answering Scientific Materialism. When naturalism becomes self-defeating, science explains everything through natural causes without needing God. This methodological success supposedly proves metaphysical naturalism. Only natural things exist. Yet defenders argue that scientism, treating science as the only source of knowledge, undermines itself, and that science actually points beyond materialism. The self-refutation problem strikes at scientism's core. The claim, only scientific statements provide knowledge, isn't itself a scientific statement. It's a philosophical claim about science. So if true, it's unknowable by its own standards. This makes scientism self-defeating, like saying all general claims are false, or I can't speak English. Furthermore, science rests on assumptions that science can't prove scientifically. The uniformity of nature, that future will resemble past. The reliability of human reason, the existence of external world. These are philosophical presuppositions that make science possible but aren't scientifically demonstrable. Science requires faith in reason, undermining the claim that only science provides justified belief. Critics respond that these presuppositions are justified pragmatically. They work. But defenders note that religious beliefs also work pragmatically for billions, providing meaning, purpose, moral guidance, community. If pragmatic success justifies scientific presuppositions, it equally justifies religious beliefs, undermining scientism's exclusive claims. The success of science supposedly eliminates God by explaining phenomena naturally. But defenders argue this confuses levels of explanation. Discovering how something works doesn't eliminate why it works, or who designed it to work that way. Newton's laws explain planetary motion without eliminating God who established those laws. Think about explaining a computer. You can explain it physically: silicon chips, electrical currents, binary logic. You can explain it functionally. Inputs, processing, outputs. You can explain it purposively. Designers created it for communication and computation. These explanations complement rather than compete. Similarly, scientific and theological explanations address different questions about same phenomena. The fine-tuning of physical constants presents powerful evidence that science points beyond itself. The cosmological constant, strong nuclear force, electron mass, and dozens of other parameters must fall within incredibly narrow ranges for atoms, chemistry, stars, and life to exist. Change any slightly, and the universe becomes sterile. Naturalists respond with multiverse theory. Countless universes with different constants make ours unsurprising. But defenders note this: trades one mystery for many. Multiverse theories themselves require fine-tuned mechanisms for generating universes. You've pushed the question back without answering it. Moreover, multiverses are speculative, not established science. Accepting them to avoid design seems like motivated reasoning. The origin of consciousness remains inexplicable on materialist terms. Subjective experience, the redness of red, the painfulness of pain, doesn't reduce to brain states. We can map neural correlates without explaining why those correlates produce experience. This is the hard problem that materialism can't solve. Materialists respond that consciousness must be physical because everything is physical. But this begs the question. Defenders argue consciousness is evidence for non-physical reality. We know consciousness exists with absolute certainty, more certain than quantum fields or dark matter. If materialism can't accommodate our most certain datum, the problem lies with materialism. The origin of life remains unexplained despite decades of research. Experiments like Miller-Urey produce simple organic molecules, but nothing approaching the complexity of self-replicating, information encoding, metabolism-maintaining systems that characterize even simplest life. The gap between non-living chemistry and living systems remains vast. Defenders don't rest on this gap, but they note that continued research deepens rather than resolves the mystery. The more we understand about life's requirements, the more improbable its chance emergence appears. DNA encodes information using arbitrary conventions like language. Information systems we understand always reflect intelligence. The mathematical structure of the universe creates additional puzzles for materialism. Physical laws have elegant mathematical forms that minds can comprehend. Why should mindless processes produce mathematical regularities? Why should human mathematics describe physical reality? Eugene Wigner called this the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics. Theism explains this. God created through mathematical logic and created minds capable of grasping that logic. Naturalism faces the puzzle of why mindless matter would conform to abstract mathematics that evolved minds happen to understand. The fit between mathematics, mind, and matter suggests common source rather than fortunate coincidence. Quantum mechanics reveals additional mysteries. Observer-dependent phenomena, non-local correlations, superposition, all suggest reality at its foundation is far stranger than materialist assumptions allow. While quantum mechanics doesn't prove God, it undermines confident materialism by showing that reality's deepest level resists materialist explanation. The argument from reason challenges materialism directly. If our thoughts are merely physical processes determined by chemistry and physics, why trust them? Chemical reactions aren't about anything. They just happen according to causal laws. But thoughts are about things. They represent reality and can be true or false. How do purely physical processes produce meaning and truth? C.S. Lewis emphasized that if naturalism is true, our beliefs are determined by non-rational causes, genetics, chemistry, environmental conditioning, not by rational insight into truth. This includes our belief in naturalism itself. So naturalism, if true, gives us reason to doubt all our beliefs, including naturalism. It's self-defeating. Materialists respond that evolution selected brains that track truth because true beliefs increase survival. But defenders note that evolution selects behaviors, not beliefs. All evolution requires is behaviors that promote survival, which could result from completely false beliefs if those false beliefs produce useful behaviors. Evolution gives us no reason to trust our beliefs are true. Furthermore, much of what we believe has no evolutionary relevance. Abstract mathematics, quantum physics, philosophical arguments. Evolution didn't select for ability to understand these things, yet we do understand them, suggesting our rationality exceeds what evolution for survival would produce. This excess points beyond natural selection to minds designed for truth-seeking. The normative dimension of rationality also challenges materialism. We don't just think. We ought to think rationally, ought to follow evidence, ought to avoid contradictions. Where does this normativity come from? Physical processes just are. They don't carry obligations. The fact that we experience rational norms as binding suggests reality has a normative structure that materialism can't explain. Defenders also challenge materialism's explanatory scope. Materialism might explain physical phenomena, but fails for other domains we consider real. Mathematics, logic, moral truths, aesthetic values, meanings, purposes. Either these don't exist, eliminative materialism, or materialism is incomplete. Most people, including most scientists, can't accept that mathematics, morality, and meaning are illusions. The predictive success of science doesn't vindicate materialism because most great scientists weren't materialists. Newton, Kepler, Galileo, Boyle, Faraday, Maxwell, Planck. The founders of modern science were theists who saw their work as discovering God's creation. If theism is anti-scientific, why did theists create science? The answer is that Christianity taught God's rational creation through law, making nature intelligible and worthy of investigation. This theological framework provided the worldview within which science flourished. Materialism came later as a philosophical add-on that science doesn't require and can't justify. Scientific materialism fails because it's self-defeating. Scientism refutes itself. Incomplete, can't explain consciousness, mathematics, morality, and unnecessary. Science arose from theistic worldview and remains compatible with it. Rather than competing with God, science succeeds because it investigates God's rational creation. Part 12, The Synthesis, Why Faith Remains Reasonable. We've examined responses to every major objection against God's existence: evil, hiddenness, diversity, bad design, science, logical paradoxes, morality, history, and suffering. Each response involves careful reasoning, nuanced distinctions, and honest engagement with difficult questions. What can we conclude? First, no objection decisively refutes theism. Every objection faces thoughtful responses that millions find satisfying. You might not find them satisfying. Reasonable people disagree about what's convincing. But the responses show that belief in God isn't irrational or intellectually dishonest. Sophisticated theology and philosophy address the hardest challenges. Second, belief rests on cumulative case rather than single decisive proof. Philosophical arguments for God, cosmological, teleological, moral, consciousness, religious experience, scriptural wisdom, personal transformation, meaningful community, beauty and order in nature. Together, these provide evidence that many find compelling despite individual objections. Think of a court trial. No single piece of evidence proves guilt beyond doubt, but cumulative evidence, motive, opportunity, physical evidence, testimony, inconsistencies, and alibi can establish guilt beyond reasonable doubt. Similarly, religious belief rests on cumulative evidence that together seems compelling even when individual pieces face objections. Third, the persistence of disagreement should humble everyone. Brilliant minds examining the same questions for millennia haven't reached consensus. This suggests the questions are genuinely difficult, the evidence genuinely ambiguous, or both. Arrogance about possessing final answers, whether theistic or atheistic, seems misplaced. Fourth, foundational intuitions shape conclusions as much as arguments themselves. Whether free will defense satisfies you depends on intuitions about freedom's value. Whether soul-making theodicy works depends on intuitions about suffering's potential meaning. Whether design arguments convince depends on intuitions about what requires explanation. These deep intuitions resist proof or refutation because they provide frameworks within which proof and refutation operate. Reasonable people can hold different intuitions, leading to different conclusions from same evidence. This doesn't mean truth doesn't exist, just that reaching truth on ultimate questions is harder than we might hope. Fifth, intellectual and existential questions intertwine but aren't identical. You might find philosophical arguments for God convincing yet struggle with prayer. You might find objections powerful intellectually, yet find religious life provides meaning practically. Integration requires ongoing work, and perfect integration might be impossible this side of eternity. Sixth, mystery and faith aren't intellectual failures, but appropriate responses to transcendent reality. If God exists and is infinite while we're finite, we should expect mystery. Faith doesn't mean believing without evidence, but trusting beyond complete understanding, maintaining commitment despite unanswered questions. Think about human relationships. You trust friends despite not understanding all their reasons. You love family despite their incomprehensible choices sometimes. You commit to spouses despite mysteries remaining in their inner lives. Similarly, faith trusts God despite mysteries, maintains relationship despite incomplete understanding. Seventh, the responses show that objections don't work in isolation. Evil seems devastating until you consider free will, soul-making, and eschatology. Hiddenness seems conclusive until you consider faith's value and freedom's requirements. Each objection connects to others, and responses form integrated framework rather than isolated defenses. Eighth, honest doubt and struggle are part of authentic faith, not opposed to it. Biblical heroes, Abraham, Job, psalmists, disciples, all wrestled with doubt while maintaining faith. The struggle is the point. Easy certainty requiring no faith would be different, arguably less valuable kind of relationship with God. Ninth, these debates matter not just for their conclusions, but for their process. Engaging deeply with hard questions develops intellectual virtues: clarity, rigor, charity, humility, ability to see multiple perspectives. Whether you end up theist, atheist, or agnostic, the wrestling makes you wiser. 10th, practical implications follow from these conclusions. If neither theism nor atheism is obviously irrational, society should respect both rather than enforcing orthodoxies. Education should present major positions fairly rather than indoctrinating one view. Public discourse should maintain civility, recognizing reasonable people disagree. The responses to objections don't eliminate uncertainty or make faith easy. They show why millions find continued belief rational, why objections don't refute decisively, and why religious commitment remains an intellectually viable option that thoughtful people can choose. This might not be the decisive victory some want, but it's intellectually honest assessment of where arguments lead. In the end, each person must decide. The responses examined here provide resources for that decision by showing how defenders engage challenges seriously. Whether these responses satisfy depends on your intuitions, experiences, and assessment of cumulative evidence. What's clear is that the choice between belief and doubt remains genuinely open for those willing to wrestle honestly with the deepest questions human minds can pose. The conversation continues because both sides raise genuine difficulties and offer genuine insights. This isn't failure, but success. Testimony to questions' depth and humanity's persistent pursuit of truth despite uncertainty. The wrestling itself honors the question's importance and our calling to seek understanding even when full comprehension exceeds our grasp. Part 13. Answering the demographic objection. When geography shapes belief. You're born in Saudi Arabia, you become Muslim. Born in India, you're likely Hindu. Born in Tennessee, probably Christian. This geographic lottery supposedly proves religion reflects culture, not truth. Yet defenders argue this objection backfires, revealing more about human nature than divine absence. The genetic fallacy appears immediately. This argument attacks how people come to believe rather than whether beliefs are true. But everything we believe is culturally influenced. Scientific method, human rights, democracy, even atheism itself. If cultural influence undermines religious belief, it undermines all beliefs, including the skepticism using this objection. Consider mathematics. If you're born in a culture without advanced mathematics, you won't discover calculus. Does this mean calculus is culturally relative rather than objectively true? Obviously not. Cultural context affects what truths we access without affecting whether those truths exist objectively. Similarly, religious truth could be objective even though cultural context affects who encounters it. The objection actually proves too much. Moral beliefs vary geographically too. Honor killings in some cultures, individual rights in others. If geographic variation undermines religious truth, it equally undermines moral truth. Yet most skeptics want to maintain moral realism while rejecting religious realism. The reasoning should apply equally to both. Furthermore, the pattern we observe, beliefs clustering geographically around historical events and spreading through cultural transmission, is exactly what we'd expect if genuine revelations occurred in specific times and places. If God revealed himself to Abraham in the Middle East, we'd expect Judaism, Christianity, and Islam clustering there initially, spreading through normal cultural mechanisms. Compare to scientific discoveries. Heliocentrism emerged in specific locations, Copernicus in Poland, Galileo in Italy, and spread through cultural transmission. People born near these pioneers had advantages in recognizing heliocentric truth. This doesn't prove heliocentrism is culturally relative. It shows how truth spreads through human communities. Defenders also note that many believers have examined alternatives and converted. The skeptic making this objection often grew up religious, but rejected their birth religion after investigation. If geography determined belief, these conversions wouldn't happen. The fact that people transcend cultural conditioning shows we're not prisoners of birthplace. Moreover, within each geographic region, tremendous diversity exists. Not every Saudi becomes Muslim. Not every Indian becomes Hindu. Not every Tennessean becomes Christian. Individual variation within cultures shows that cultural influence doesn't determine belief mechanistically. People make choices transcending their cultural contexts. The objection assumes that if God wanted everyone to know truth, God would ensure uniform distribution of religious knowledge. But this assumes God values correct belief above everything. If God values freedom, authentic seeking, and ultimate relationship more than coerced correct belief, then allowing geographic variation makes sense pedagogically. Think about education. Good teachers don't just tell students answers, but create environments where students discover truth themselves, make mistakes, learn from errors. They allow diversity of approaches, recognizing different students need different paths to understanding. Similarly, God might value humanity's diverse journeys toward truth more than imposed uniformity. The salvation question seems most pressing. If salvation requires Christian faith, but billions never hear the gospel, how is this fair? Defenders offer multiple responses depending on theological commitments. Inclusivist Christians argue that Christ's sacrifice potentially saves those who never heard if they respond to whatever divine light they received. This isn't universalism claiming everyone is saved. It's recognizing that God judges hearts rather than mere verbal profession. Someone who follows conscience, seeks ultimate truth, and responds to general revelation might be responding to Christ implicitly, even without knowing his name. C.S. Lewis explored this in his Narnia books. Those who serve good unknowingly serve Aslan. Critics object this makes evangelism pointless. But defenders respond that even if some are saved without hearing, many aren't, making evangelism vitally important. Moreover, explicit knowledge of Christ provides assurance, community, and fullness of relationship that general revelation cannot. There's a difference between being saved and knowing you're saved. The demographic objection also assumes equal access equals fair judgment. But God can tailor judgment to individual circumstances. Someone who never heard the gospel faces different standards than someone who rejected explicit preaching. This isn't arbitrary, but reflects God's perfect knowledge of each person's situation, opportunities, and responses. Furthermore, even those who never heard of Christ encountered moral law, conscience, creation's testimony, and opportunities for seeking ultimate truth. Those who respond with humility and openness position themselves for whatever further truth God might reveal, whether in this life or beyond. The question isn't, did they hear about Jesus? But did they respond to the truth they encountered? The objection that Christianity's geographic clustering undermines its truth claims actually supports truth claims when examined carefully. Truth often emerges in specific contexts and spreads through cultural contact. Christianity's historical rootedness, specific person, specific time, specific place, makes it verifiable or falsifiable in ways that abstract philosophies aren't. If Christianity were merely cultural invention, we'd expect it to reflect its cultural origins completely. Yet Christianity contradicted its Jewish and Greco-Roman contexts in fundamental ways, claiming a crucified criminal as God, elevating women and slaves, rejecting ethnic nationalism, proclaiming resurrection when Greeks believed soul's immortality. These countercultural elements suggest Christianity transcends mere cultural creation. The diversity within Christianity, thousands of denominations despite geographic spread, is cited as confirming the demographic objection. But this diversity shows two things. First, core beliefs remain remarkably stable. Christ's divinity, resurrection, salvation by grace, despite 2,000 years and global spread. Second, humans inevitably interpret divine revelation through cultural lenses without this making revelation itself culturally relative. Think about interpreting Shakespeare. Different cultures emphasize different themes, stage productions differently, translate into various languages. This diversity reflects interpretive challenges, not Shakespeare's non-existence. Similarly, theological diversity reflects interpretation's difficulty, not revelation's absence. The demographic objection fails because it commits genetic fallacy, proves too much against moral truth, expects patterns incompatible with historical revelation, and ignores that people transcend cultural conditioning regularly. Geographic influence on belief is real, but doesn't show. Beliefs are merely cultural, rather than responses to truth encountered through cultural contexts. Part 14. The practical difference. When belief transforms lives. The intellectual arguments matter, but ultimately, religious belief's value shows in transformed lives. Critics claim belief makes no positive practical difference or even causes harm. Yet defenders point to measurable benefits and unmeasurable goods that belief produces in billions of lives. The happiness research shows religious believers report higher life satisfaction, better mental health, and greater sense of purpose than non-believers on average. This correlation persists across cultures, controlling for other variables. Critics respond that this just shows religion is comforting, not true. But defenders note that if God designed humans for relationship with Him, we'd expect this exact pattern: fulfillment through living according to our design. The meaning and purpose objection, that religion provides false but comforting meaning, assumes meaning must be true to be valuable. But if God exists and religion accurately identifies our purpose, then the meaning isn't false, but genuine. The comfort comes from discovering true purpose, not inventing false ones. You can't use the comfort as evidence against truth without begging the question. The charitable giving statistics show religious believers donate more money and time to charity than non-believers, even to secular causes. Religious communities provide social support, care for the vulnerable, and organize relief efforts globally. Critics attribute this to social pressure rather than genuine conviction. But defenders note that motivation matters less than results. Those in need receive help, regardless of donors' psychological states. The transformation of individuals provides powerful testimony. Addicts find recovery through religious conversion when secular programs failed. Prisoners experience genuine rehabilitation through faith. Broken families reconcile. Bitter people forgive. Anxious people find peace. These transformations occur regularly enough to demand explanation beyond placebo effects or coincidence. Critics dismiss these as selection bias. We hear about successes, but not failures. Fair point. But even accounting for bias, the scale of transformation is significant. Millions report that faith changed their lives fundamentally, providing strength to overcome challenges they couldn't face alone. If belief were merely false comfort, why such dramatic behavioral changes? The moral behavior question produces mixed evidence. Religious people aren't obviously more moral than non-religious people statistically. Both populations include saints and scoundrels. But defenders argue that religious moral failures don't refute religion any more than scientific errors refute science. The question is whether religion provides resources for moral living, not whether all religious people use those resources successfully. Moreover, the moral framework religion provides, objective values grounded in God, divine accountability, command to love others, promise of divine help in moral struggle, offers resources that naturalistic ethics lacks. Whether individuals use these resources varies, but the resources exist for those who take faith seriously. The problem of religious violence seems to count heavily against belief's practical value. Wars, inquisitions, terrorism, oppression, all committed in God's name. Yet defenders note that atheistic ideologies produced the 20th century's worst atrocities. Stalin, Mao, Pol Pot killed tens of millions in explicitly atheistic regimes. Religious violence and atheistic violence both reveal human capacity for evil using whatever ideology is available. Furthermore, most religious violence distorts religious teachings rather than following them. Jesus commanded loving enemies. Muhammad restricted warfare and protected non-combatants. Buddha taught nonviolence. When believers commit violence, they typically violate their tradition's core teachings. This shows human corruption of religion, not religion's inherent violence. The social progress objection notes that progressive causes, abolition, women's rights, civil rights, often opposed religious establishments. Yet defenders emphasize that these movements were also led by religious believers citing religious principles. William Wilberforce fought slavery based on Christian conviction. Martin Luther King Jr. led civil rights using Christian theology. Religious establishments resisted change, but religious conviction also drove change. This shows religion is like any human institution. It can be used well or badly. The question isn't whether religion has been misused. Obviously it has. But whether authentic religious faith, properly understood and practiced, improves human life. Defenders argue the answer is yes, pointing to countless examples. The community and belonging that religion provides addresses fundamental human needs. Humans are social creatures requiring connection and purpose larger than themselves. Religious communities provide these, creating bonds across class, race, and generation. The decline of religious community in secular societies hasn't been replaced adequately, contributing to epidemic loneliness and social fragmentation. The framework for suffering that religion provides helps people cope with tragedy. When disaster strikes, religious believers have resources, divine purpose, eternal perspective, community support, prayer, hope beyond death, that purely secular worldviews struggle to provide. This isn't evidence for truth directly, but it shows religion addresses real human needs in ways that work practically for billions. The cultivation of virtue through religious practice, prayer, meditation, service, worship, sacraments, provides structured paths for moral and spiritual development. Secular alternatives exist, but lack the comprehensive frameworks, community support, and transcendent motivation that religious practice provides. The monastic traditions, spiritual disciplines, and moral formation systems refined over millennia represent accumulated wisdom about human flourishing. Critics respond that secular approaches to ethics, community, and meaning can provide everything religion provides without false metaphysics. But defenders note that secular alternatives are often parasitic on religious frameworks, borrowing moral intuitions and community structures while abandoning the metaphysical foundations that originally grounded them. Whether these borrowed elements remain stable without their foundations is an open empirical question. The practical difference argument doesn't prove God exists. Happy, transformed lives could theoretically result from beneficial delusions, but it shows that belief isn't merely abstract philosophy. It shapes billions of lives in measurable ways, often for the better. Combined with intellectual arguments, this practical dimension strengthens the cumulative case for faith's rationality. Part 15. The ultimate integration. When head and heart align. We've examined intellectual responses to objections and practical benefits of belief. But the deepest reason many believe isn't arguments or benefits, but personal encounter with divine reality that transforms everything. This experiential dimension completes the case for faith's reasonableness. Religious experience comes in countless forms: mystical union, answered prayer, felt presence, moral transformation, beauty that points beyond itself, moments of transcendence, consolation in suffering, guidance in confusion. Millions report experiences they interpret as encountering God, not as abstract concept, but as living reality. Critics dismiss these as psychological phenomena, explainable naturally. Brain states correlate with religious experiences. Cultural conditioning shapes their interpretation. Suggestion and expectation influence their occurrence. All true. But defenders argue that explaining how we experience God doesn't explain away what we experience. Finding neural correlates of vision doesn't prove tables don't exist. The parallel with other minds illustrates this. You never experience others' consciousness directly. You infer it from behavior, speech, facial expressions. Similarly, you never experience God directly in sensory way, but infer divine presence from various signs and experiences. If you trust other minds' inference, why distrust divine presence inference when many report similar experiences across cultures? The transformation that religious experience produces provides evidence for its veridicality. Experiences that change lives permanently, heal psychological wounds, produce lasting moral improvement, and provide meaning that sustains through decades suggest something more than wishful thinking. Purely subjective delusions rarely produce such stable, beneficial, long-term effects. The universality of religious experience across cultures suggests humans encounter genuine transcendent reality rather than inventing it. Yes, interpretations vary culturally, but the core experience, encountering something ultimate, transcendent, holy, appears universally. This suggests either God reveals himself to all cultures or humans universally project divinity. The first seems simpler. The ineffability of mystical experience, its resistance to description, fits better with encountering transcendent reality than with neurological glitch. If God infinitely exceeds human categories, we'd expect experiences of God to overflow our concepts, leaving us grasping for inadequate words. This is exactly what mystics across traditions report. The noetic quality, the sense that experience conveys knowledge, distinguishes religious experiences from mere emotions. People don't just feel something, but know something through the experience. They gain insight, understanding, conviction that transcends ordinary knowing. This cognitive dimension suggests the experience involves more than subjective feeling. Critics note that religious experiences conflict. Christians encounter Jesus, Muslims encounter Allah, Hindus encounter Brahman. These interpretations contradict, suggesting cultural conditioning rather than divine reality. But defenders respond that interpretation layers onto experience. The raw experience might be similar, while cultural frameworks shape how it's understood and articulated. Think about experiencing beauty. Everyone can experience beauty, but cultural contexts shape what objects seem beautiful and how beauty is described. Similarly, everyone might encounter divine reality, but cultural contexts shape how that encounter is interpreted and expressed. The diversity proves experiences reality rather than refuting it. Genuine experiences always get filtered through interpretive frameworks. The integration of intellectual arguments, practical benefits, and personal experience creates cumulative case that many find compelling. No single element proves God decisively, but together they provide overwhelming reason for belief. The philosophical arguments show belief is rational, the practical benefits show belief is beneficial, and personal experience shows belief is existentially real. This integration addresses different human dimensions. The intellect requires philosophical satisfaction. Belief must make sense, cohere with other knowledge, answer objections reasonably. The will requires practical motivation. Belief must make difference, guide life, produce good fruit. The heart requires personal encounter. Belief must be lived reality, not abstract theory. When all three dimensions align, head satisfied intellectually, will motivated practically, heart encountering personally, belief becomes not just possible, but compelling. This alignment explains why many believers find continued faith natural despite objections. They're not ignoring difficulties, but weighing them against comprehensive positive case that addresses whole person. The journey metaphor captures this better than courtroom metaphor. Legal thinking aims for decisive proof beyond reasonable doubt. Religious thinking involves ongoing relationship where understanding deepens gradually. You don't prove a spouse's love once and finish. You continually experience love in ways that deepen trust despite occasional confusion. Similarly, religious faith isn't belief established once by decisive argument, then maintained unchanging. It's lived relationship where understanding grows, doubts arise and are addressed. Experience deepens conviction, and commitment sustains through uncertainty. The intellectual responses to objections we've examined support this ongoing journey without claiming to eliminate all mystery. The mystery that remains isn't bug, but feature. If God is infinite and we're finite, we should expect understanding to remain partial. Complete comprehension would suggest we've reduced God to manageable concept rather than encountering transcendent reality. The apophatic tradition, theology of unknowing, recognizes this appropriately. Yet mystery doesn't mean obscurity or irrationality. It means recognizing limits while affirming what we can know. We can know God exists, cares about us, revealed himself in Christ, offers salvation, and calls us to love, all while acknowledging We don't understand exhaustively how divine providence works or why God permits specific evils. This limited but real knowledge suffices for faith and life. The responses to objections examined throughout this exploration show why millions find faith reasonable despite real challenges. Each objection receives serious engagement, careful analysis, and thoughtful response. The responses don't satisfy everyone. Reasonable disagreement persists, but they show that belief remains intellectually viable, practically beneficial, and existentially real for those who find the cumulative case compelling. In the end, each person must weigh arguments, evidence, experience, and intuitions to reach their own conclusion. These responses provide resources for that decision by showing how thoughtful believers engage challenges honestly. Whether you find them convincing depends on your own wrestling with these ultimate questions. What's clear is that the conversation continues because both challenges and responses raise genuine insights that advance human understanding, even when consensus remains elusive. The explored answers to objections don't make faith easy or doubt impossible. They show that the intellectual obstacles to belief, while real, aren't insurmountable. Reasonable, informed, thoughtful people can maintain faith because sophisticated responses exist to sophisticated objections, because cumulative evidence across multiple dimensions provides compelling case, and because personal encounter with divine reality transforms abstract possibility into lived conviction. This may not satisfy those demanding certainty, but it explains why billions find faith not just psychologically comforting, but intellectually defensible and existentially true.